My name is Willem Volkersz. I'm the artist of this retrospective exhibition, which is called The View from Here. It's a 25-year retrospective, which means looking back over the last 25 years of my work. I was born in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in 1939, just before the onset of World War II. Growing up during World War II was, for me as a young boy, was primarily an adventure, although for my parents it was obviously very, very different. They had at the time 5 children. I actually wore a dog tag walking to school, just in case we might get hurt or might have to be located somehow. My parents were very active in the resistance, and they hid Jews in our home. And my father was a paper merchant, and he sold paper for the underground press, which was obviously a very illegal activity from the perspective of the Nazis. And so he had a place in the house where he could hide in case there were raids, known as razzias. And word would come down the street that they were on their way. My father would hide underneath the floor. He had, it was a very small space. I saw it after the war as a child. He had in there a little bit of food and water and a blanket so that he could be there for hours or overnight if need be. We, as young kids, spent a lot of time collecting shells and like mortar shells. We had a damaged rifle. We had a cartridge belt. We had a Nazi helmet. Those were kind of our toys of the day. So it was, I have more memories of it being an adventure, whereas my parents, of course, were very much worried about the safety of all of us. I started to draw airplanes dropping out of the sky and bombs dropping when I was pretty young. I had a younger brother whom I did a portrait of when I was quite young. In school, we actually had artists coming to visit. They weren't so much art teachers, they were real artists, quote unquote, who were hired to come into the school and give us art lessons. After the war, my parents decided they wanted to emigrate and leave all that rubble and a poor economy in Europe behind. And my father researched places to move to. He had some business connections in New York City, so he came to New York. So this is a way of getting to the point where I was in high school in Seattle at age 15, which is, we obviously moved to Seattle, and I took art classes there. And it was actually a school that later became an arts magnet school, Garfield High School in Seattle. Jimi Hendrix attended that school, Quincy Jones attended that school, neither of whom I knew personally, but that gives you an idea of the kind of focus the school had and the kind of opportunities they provided for us. We had an annual budget meeting at my house, and my father told me I had to earn $750 a year to add to the family budget, and I was 14, so he took me up and down University Avenue in Seattle and had me go into stores and ask for jobs, and I got real lucky in being hired by an interior design store. So they sold like furniture, dinnerware, even jewelry, very contemporary design pieces. And all the principals in the firm were architects and artists. They've been trained as architects and artists, and they took me under their wings. So I started to work for them when I was 15, and when I turned 16, they gave me the keys to their delivery truck, and I started to deliver work all over the gifts primarily that people had purchased in the Seattle area. And so having people who, once again, supported me in my interests, it was never, oh, you don't want to be an artist, you'll never make a living at that. It was always like, go for it. And so I had that kind of support early on. That was really an important foundation to my becoming a professional artist. So when I was a teenager, and I had jobs, I started to save some money, and I bought initially a motor scooter and later a car, and I started to explore kind of the western United States during spring breaks, summers, etc. And I started to document. I was always a photographer to begin with. I actually had a photography business when I was in high school. I had a 4x5 Crown Graphic. I did portraits of couples at dances and things. I did weddings, things like that. And so my eyes were wide open by this culture, which was so different from what I'd grown up with in Amsterdam, in my native Holland. I started to see neon signs. I started to see vernacular architecture, roadside gardens. People who had developed as folk artists had decorated their gardens, and so I started to document all that. And in due time, although originally I was trained as a painter at the University of Washington, I started to want to liven that up a little bit. So from working on canvas, I started to work on plywood panels, and so that I could actually attach objects to those panels. And I always think of my pieces sort of like going down an American highway, seeing a neon sign here, a roadside billboard there. I'm kind of recreating that kind of visual excitement of moving down the highway, but also moving down our visual culture. And in the end, I also started to visit second-hand stores. I bought a lot of small objects which now enter my work to help augment the story that I'm telling. Most of my work actually is kind of narrative in nature. My very early work was non-objective, meaning kind of abstract. And I'd see people kind of standing there saying, "Oh, that's interesting," and then move on. And I wanted to engage people more. And also I'd lived life long enough that I had some stories to tell. So the work became more storytelling or narrative. When I ended up teaching and living in Montana, I wanted to share that experience of what it was like as someone who grew up in a big city in Europe to suddenly live in the kind of semi-wilderness of the West. Follow Your Bliss is about that very notion of living in the West. It's a self-portrait pointing into an idealized kind of landscape. The idealized landscape comes from a paint-by-number painting. When my wife and I were traveling and we'd stop at the junk stores or second-hand stores or antique stores, we'd find these paint-by-number paintings which were very unfamiliar to me. They weren't part of my culture back in Europe. And so I started to collect those. And I find that a lot of the paint-by-number paintings are very idealized kind of landscapes, but oddly enough, they come very close to where I live now. The landscape that is depicted in this paint-by-number painting, excuse me, is actually real close to what I see out my studio window. In other words, we have a stream in the backyard. We have deer running through. We have elk nearby. So we actually live in many ways in a very ideal kind of landscape. So I also think that these idealized landscapes are very much like an immigrant's dream. In front of the landscape is a chair with a palette, as if I'm painting that landscape. So I'm very much sort of engaged in not only depicting the landscape, but showing the process of how these works are made. The materials I use reflect my interest in American kind of pop culture, especially while I was growing up in the 50s and 60s in Seattle. And when I was in graduate school in my early years as a college teacher, I thought, how can I introduce neon into my own work? So I went to a sign company. I was then teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute, which is a professional art college. And I was there for 18 years, teaching from 1968 to 1986. And I went to a sign company and I said, how do you make neon? And so they showed me how to make a pattern. So I draw a pattern on paper, and that pattern is then carefully followed by a sign bender, a neon tube bender. And I also indicate the diameter of the neon and the color. The colors are primarily made from two different gases, neon, which burns red, and argon, which burns, burns blue. All the other variants are made with fluorescent powders that are coated on the inside of the tube. So it comes that way from the manufacturer. My influences are varied. When I was a kid, my parents knew of my interest in art, and they bought me an annual pass to the Stedelijk Museum, which is a municipal museum in Amsterdam. And I would, after school, I would just walk over there and wander into the museum and through the galleries. And early influences were people like Paul Klee, the Swiss artist, Van Gogh, obviously. And I say obviously because a lot of my work, especially in recent years, has been influenced directly by Van Gogh. So in my newer pieces, my paint is becoming a little looser and expressionistic, much like what Van Gogh kind of did in his work. And when I travel, or when my wife and I travel, we always visit museums. We do two things. We go to concerts and we go to museums. And just a few weeks ago, we were at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao in Spain. And so that interest in looking at art continues to be important, and I am often influenced or impacted by the kind of passion that these artists show for different kinds of materials and different kinds of expression. The way I work is pretty much by myself in my studio. So when we moved to Bozeman, we got lucky. We bought 6 acres of land with a log house, and there was enough room to build a studio. And so I had a friend of mine, an architect friend, design a studio for me and built it within a stone's throw of the house. The nice thing is there's no distractions. Although there's a phone in my studio, and of course I have an iPhone, I don't really respond to that or turn them off. In words, I'm pretty much by myself and playing music and focusing just on my work. So I try to communicate in my work maybe a number of things. One would be that it's a way of working that's a little unusual in the sense that I combine a variety of materials. And there's the whole impact of the paint by number painting. So I have a collection of probably 100 or so paint by number paintings. And I also have a large postcard collection. So I'm opening up territory that when I was in school studying painting, that they never would have suggested or felt appropriate. I was taught during an era when something called abstract expressionism was a very popular art form, and you painted very loosely, sort of on canvas. And my teachers told me, you always clean things up too much. But they never really suggested that I might be developing an aesthetic whereby cleaning up or being precise was an important part of the final product. So it's important when you're growing as an artist that you find in due time an aesthetic, a way of working that works well for your personality and your background. And so I think I've come up with an aesthetic that works really well for me. I had my first solo exhibition in Montana at Paris Gibson. So when we first moved to Montana, I was asked to do a neon installation for Paris Gibson Square. And I strung 2 clotheslines diagonally across the gallery and hung the neon from the clotheslines. And that installation was called Inventory, and it also went to the Holter Museum in Helena. In those years in between, I was in several group exhibitions and solo exhibitions at the museum as well, under different curators. So I've shown here 3 or 4 times over the years. And we contacted, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 museums, and 6 in the end decided to host this exhibition. So it's been traveling since 2021, it's now 2024. So it's been traveling for 3 years, and this is the last venue, and it's coming home in February of 2025. What I'd like people to remember is maybe my love, my passion for life, for my life in the West, for a way of making art, for finding your own voice. I suppose that's really kind of crucial and important, central to what I do. It took me some years. I hope that people will take away my love for art, my love for making art, for the process, for exploration, for curiousness, the importance of having faith in your own ability to stick with it in the studio, to develop your own point of view, your own method of making art, and having that body of work actually become your legacy.